Hi, everybody.
Hey,
Hey, what's up, guys?
Welcome to week 2 of our efforts to learn how to read the Bible and some basics of theology, the Marquezian way. Just a quick overview. Let's do a summary of Genesis, the first 3 chapters of Genesis. Basically, what we have is the story of creation. It's the logical way a story should start, at the start. And so we have several elements. We have the creator who was, and from everything that's not him is created by him. And so out of that creation story, we have some of the beginning workings of the bigger story. And some of those elements are the introduction of humanity, and then humanity's eating of this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is a big part of the story. And then what happens just before that and just after that. And so we have creation being set, and then the players kind of in line. So another thing that happens is the fruit that comes from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
there you go.
Which kind of could seem enigmatic. And then there's like story just before and story just after that tree.
Mm-hmm.
And everything that happens in there sets the stage for everything that's going to take place in the rest of the Bible. The rest of the Bible, in essence, responds through chapter. How's that for a summary, Lynn?
Fine.
Am I missing anything?
Nope, that's it.
So was there anything glaring that stood out to any of you that you would like for me to respond to before we dive in?
I'm ready to dive in.
Yeah, I could shoot I feel like I could ask a question about every other sentence, but I think 2 that really stood out would be, what do you think about the line, like, he created man in his image? I find that pretty interesting. I guess, do you want me to do them one at a time, or I'll give you 2?
So first, let me say that for anybody that's watching live on Facebook, I encourage you to chime in and write any questions, and we'll try to field as many questions as we can, or if you have comments, we'll try to watch out for those. Lynn is going to be watching out for the Facebook world and kind of cluing us in to add to the conversation from Facebook land. Okay, so being created in God's image, that is one of the big giant themes that we're going to hit, and we're going to take a lot of care to go through that. But I think we have some background information to go to before we get to being created in God's image. And I think this is particularly an area that's misunderstood and overlooked. And so I want to take a lot of care and attention to get to that part. So I know that's not
Fair
an
enough.
answer, but it.
Yeah, no. I feel like that is like a core piece of this for sure.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
then I guess like the other one that I think I figure would have an interesting answer to it is when they see God walking through the garden after eating the apple, and God's like, "Why are you hiding from me?" And they're like, because we're naked. And he's like, "How do you know you're naked?"
Right.
And I just thought that was pretty interesting. I don't really know what to take from it.
Yeah, so that's another something that we're going to kind of hit. And some of these things are really, I think, wonderfully and beautifully, deeply philosophic and like artistic and literary.
Yeah,
So
I think that's why I really
to
honed
think
in on them, was it was like, man, those are like, if somebody wrote that, they'd probably get a Pulitzer Prize or something like that, digging into those concepts.
I
So
think
in a big way, what we're looking at when we talk about the nakedness here, we tend to want to go think about things in terms of shame. And shame of recent times has taken on kind of a different maybe a different definition than it has held in the past, especially with a lot of the work of like Brene Brown and stuff like that, which I think she's done some really good things. She's put some really good stuff out there. But shame has started to take on a new, like, I don't know, the psych industry, psychological kinds of counseling and psychology and things like that have kind of taken this idea of shame and used it for their benefit in really good ways. But it does talk about shame, but it talks about shame in light of vulnerability, and a negative kind of vulnerability. A vulnerability not where I'm being open and willing to share, but a vulnerability where I'm unprotected and I'm out to face the world without kind of a certain kind of protection. And we'll field that more specifically as we carry on. Were you going to say something, Lynn?
Yes, I was going to say that Blythe's question that she asked off the air, we should probably just go ahead and address.
Can you remind me, Blythe?
Are we taking these 7 days of creation literally, or are we taking those as maybe more not literal?
Okay, so we are going to take the literature on its terms to the best that we can do.
Okay.
It is my belief that the literature does not avail itself to a final answer on the matter. I will share with you my personal opinion, and that is I personally believe that Adam and Eve existed in space-time history and were real people, but I don't know how long it took for them to be created, and I don't know how long creation actually took.
Right.
And I'm not married to that, and it's not essential to the story. The story is told with kind of leaving a little bit of mystery there. The Bible as a whole leaves some mystery. Sometimes it talks about things like 1,000 days, or a day is as 1,000 years to the Lord, and 1,000 years is a day.
Oh.
And so
That's a simile from the book of Psalms,
Okay.
where they're comparing the passage of time. So to God, 1 day feels like 1,000 days.
Well, I kind of also went a little bit ahead, and when they were speaking about Noah, they were saying he was, so old, like over hundreds. Is that for real? Was he
like a actual
that
calendar year?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
According
Yeah,
to the Jewish calendar, that's yeah.
Okay.
I think that was one of the first questions I shot over to Adam, was like,
Was Noah that old?
why did people live that long? Like, what is that a part of this book?
Yeah.
And then the further I got in there, you definitely see that it's just a theme of people living less long as it progressed.
I noticed
which is
that
like
too.
a pretty interesting literary.
It got down to
If
like
you're just looking at it from
150.
like a novel standpoint, like somebody using that would be telling you something with that device.
Also, these are great questions, but like Adam said, the answer doesn't actually matter to the overarching theme of the story.
Yeah.
If you believe in a God that can create something from nothing, right? Then it doesn't matter if it took him 7 literal days or 7,000 literal days or 7 million literal days, right? I mean, creating something from nothing is something that we can't do.
Okay, Adam, I guess I got another question that might be a better jumping off point.
Okay.
What's a firmament?
Firmament.
Yeah.
So firmament refers kind of to some translations call it a vault, and there are people who've done a lot of work on just this specific Hebrew word, and they call it a vault, and it is supposed to be like this kind of a but I don't want to speak to it too much. Firmament, I don't want to get beyond my knowledge base. So
Could we just say like
our
a
purposes
divide?
and what we're doing, the firmament is basically like the terrestrial ground is what we'll work with for the sake of our purposes, right? So like the
It's not
firmament,
the sky.
you know what? I am confusing terms, and this is why you are here, Lynn.
Yes. The
So
firmament is like the heavens.
yeah, and which is like the dome.
Yes.
So,
So think dome of the sky.
and actually, it's kind of an awkward word because some of this stuff has obscure language because it's supposed to be understood obscurely. And I know that sounds like a cheating answer, but the truth is we're making a distinction between kind of what we know is out there without having to be precise about it. Because see, if in the literary kind of in a literary move, if we add precision at any point, then our focus needs to go to that point of precision, right? So like, what's an example? Marc Chagall painted a painting of he and his lover, his wife. And in this painting, he's floating off the ground and his body kind of is wrapping around her. And it's like this figurative, allegorical kind of rendering of their love. That you can see how in his love, he's just floating in the air because of his love that he has for her and surrounds her with himself. And the colors are conducive to this like feeling and emotion of like what he pins to love and how he feels for her. But then weirdly in the corner is like this tapestry that, so everything is like this kind of dreamy. And then in the corner is like this tapestry, which is very specific and precise. And like the design on the tapestry is concrete. It's not all dreamy and fluid. And so your mind automatically goes to that tapestry and you start questioning about the tapestry. And I am going to argue that this was done with intent. So where we see imprecision, we're free to kind of go with the flow of the book and the story. And where we see precision, we're going to want to hone down or hone in on it. Or if there's something odd that stands out or is misplaced, there you go.
Yep.
Oh, wow.
That's pretty cool.
Yep.
Yeah.
So when there's something that's out of place, that's what we're going to be looking at. And when there's something that has this precise kind of a, I don't know, greater precision, we're going to want to focus on that.
I'm good with going with the flow.
When something is open-ended and given like non-specifics, we're going to tend to leave that alone. Now, we can dive into firmament and get more because a lot of people have done work over this thing that's like called a dome and what the dome is. And a lot of it is speculation. And so as I've read up on this, as you follow these leads of speculation, it's interesting, but it's not giving us a whole lot to the story. A couple of people have written on it, which gives us like a little something to think about, but not enough to take us away from the other stuff we're going to.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously didn't know what it means, and I kept reading, and it made sense, and like I was able, it wasn't a big barrier there. And I'm actually looking at, I guess I'm looking at a different version now because it uses expanse instead of firmament.
I mean, you were right. It's basically this separation of like the earth from the heavens.
Yeah.
And then you've got another separation, you know, the earth from the waters. So it's basically separating out sort of the physical world in the Genesis story.
Which is, and now we've come upon a theme. Over and over again, we see this division and this separating. It's like God is organizing.
It's classification.
Classification. He's separating this from this and making a distinction and a classification. And he does this over and over again. And we'll get to this point later, but he does this with the human, with the male, with the feminine and the masculine. He makes a separation. And that's going to be important, and that's going to have something to do with our that is going to be involved when we start talking about God being, or us being created in God's image. But before we get there, let's kind of use this idea of separation to segue in. There are a couple of things that we want to say from the start. Probably the most philosophically brilliant place to start a story is at the beginning with creation, especially if we're talking about philosophy. I think it was Arthur W. Pink who brought the point up that to start with creator is like the most ingenious, brilliant place to start. And so we start with God as kind of a central point. He's a center point. He is a fixed figure that is stable, and everything else that exists is not him. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the deep. Without form and void, this terminology really lends itself to the idea of chaos, which was a big theme in the kind of contemporary culture surrounding the Genesis writers. Oh, and I say Genesis writers, let me just take a quick little brief moment to state this. Moses is given credit for writing the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And scholars kind of scoff at this because they say it's obviously cobbled together from lots of different sources. And what I'm going to say to that is it's like when any of our presidents do something like, this is not a pro or anti-Trump statement. He just happens to be our current president. If President Trump sets out to cut taxes and he says, we've cut taxes, did Trump actually go over there and do the paperwork taxes? No, his administration did it. He has a whole staff of people that make this take place, and he gets credit for it. And so Trump cut taxes. When we say Trump cut taxes, we're saying Trump's administration did this. And so when Moses wrote the Pentateuch, he and his team wrote the Pentateuch. He orchestrated the production of the Pentateuch. All right. So
can I add something?
Yeah.
In addition to having the different people write it down, before we had written words, we had oral storytelling. And it was a position with high responsibility because you were trusted with the history of your people, right? And so they would study and they would practice and they would tell the story out loud over and over and over again. Imagine walking through the desert and there's no electricity and there's no distractions, so there's no toys for the kids to play. And so when you're done walking and walking and walking and walking, they're gonna sit down around the campfire and make their evening meal, and then the storytellers are gonna come out and they tell the history of the people. So they're gonna say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it's so the story has a lot of its power and a lot of its literary form because it was an oral story. It was something that was told over and over again, probably for a really long time before it was finally written down under Moses's administration.
Wow.
So when this story is cobbled together by God and Moses and this team, it's not cobbled together in a vacuum. It's not a story that just exists without context. It is influenced and speaks to its surrounding. It's just like God had to choose a language for this to be conveyed in because people wouldn't understand it unless it was in a language they understood. So just like that, they have cultural ideas that these concepts that are brought out have to be attached to. And one of those ideas is like the idea of chaos. For the surrounding cultures, chaos was the great evil. Chaos was the thing to be feared. Chaos was what everything broke down into. And so in saying that God hovered over the face of the deep, and that this idea that there was chaos that he ordered and structured, that void that's talked about in the first couple of verses, that it was without form and void, is this idea of chaos that existed or was kind of the ruling thing that was structured or brought together. And so God is this great organizer who creates, but he creates in organizational specificity. And that's important because he's Lord of chaos, but he's more than Lord of chaos. He brings nothingness into order. It's not just haphazardness. He has order and structure that we can count on. And so that serves several different purposes, but it stood in opposition to some of the other kind of creation stories that existed in that cultures, like contemporary other surrounding cultures. And it was almost a declaration that this God is supreme over your gods. Sure, you could have a God of chaos, but our God is a God of that. That's one of the statements. Another statement is just the philosophic idea that he brings about order and that he's a God of order. And so he does this thing of division and classification. And indeed, that first chapter has a lot of continuity to it. Like we have 6 days of creation with a seventh day that kind of breaks the pattern a little bit, but with a lot of very consistent things that take place. And we can look at any number of those, but the one that I like to really point out is that whenever God's commanding voice interrupts the narrative, creation responds, it was so. Let there be light, and it was so. So if we go through these days, we find this consistent kind of response of creation. So that if this was being told orally, like Lynn was suggesting, to a whole community, then even a little 5-year-old child would know and be cued to understand that the way it works is when that voice of God interrupts the narrative, like it's going to happen without question. So here's an interesting other time that God's commanding voice interrupts the narrative. And I'm going to quote, it says, he commanded them to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, saying, on the day you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. So what's going to happen? When they eat, what, Blythe?
They're going to come of knowledge. I don't know. They're going to die eventually.
They're going to die. Yeah.
They will die.
Their lives are going to change forever.
Here's an area where theologians and philosophers have struggled for centuries. Because like you kind of brought up earlier, Blythe, I think it was you, Blythe, or maybe it was you, Sal, who said, after these 3 chapters, we're told lives to 900 plus years.
Yeah.
So whether that's literal or not, it kind of doesn't matter. The point is that the story insists that he didn't die. And that should be like, dun, 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 what's going on here? Mm-hmm. Well, what we can so what ends up happening is philosophers and theologians. Hi, son. Yeah. Daddy's talking right now. You can sit down and be quiet by me, or you can go play with your siblings. It's your choice.
What's up, bud?
Okay, go talk to mommy about it and she will help you.
Sorry. So you were saying that it doesn't matter that Adam is 900 years old. The important point to note is that he didn't die.
Right. But we are led to believe that on the day you eat, or in the Hebrew, it's more than just on the day that you eat. It's like the way of saying like that moment. At that moment, at that moment that you eat, you are going to die. And so what I propose is that they ate and they did die, just like we're expected to understand.
I took it as their innocence died.
Okay.
That's how I took it.
Which I think probably is absolutely true. And that's part of why we're saying, I said probably absolutely. That is absolutely true. And that's part of where this vulnerability and shame come in, because there's this death of their innocence that was assumed. But I think it goes more than that. I think we're supposed to understand everything at the point of ingestion is death being described.
Your connection is really bad. Can you say that again?
Yeah. So we are to understand that whatever happens at the point that they eat, that point of ingestion, is death. So we are about to witness, as soon as they eat, what death looks like for the whole rest of the story. And what it looks like is hiding and shame and vulnerability and blame. And it looks like everything that's described, like, because you ate, this will happen. Because you ate, this will happen. And he goes to Eve and he goes to Adam and he goes to the serpent and he lists what the consequences are going to be. Classically, this is thought to be like a series of punishments for the great transgression that they committed. But I'm going to argue and say we are getting a view into see what death looks like. And death is all of these things. And if we were to sum that up, we can say that death is the breakdown of ideal relationship. It's ideal relationship broken. And that falls into three categories. If you read everything that happens after ingestion for this pericope, right? Then you'll see that there are three categories of relationship that get broken. One is between humans and God. Another is between humans and humans. And another is between humans and creation. And so death for this story is a breakdown in ideal relationship between humans and God, human to human, and humans and creation. And these themes will happen throughout the rest of the book. They'll continually be referred to. How God, so when we see God's anger and God's wrath in the Old Testament, it's always connected to his grief over the breakdown of relationships in one or more of those categories. And so his grief comes out as anger. And his punishment, by the way, I'm getting a little sidetracked. His punishment always exists not as like this big giant revenge, but as an effort to reset the button to get relationship back on track. But we can explore that later and we can talk about that as Genesis moves forward. For now, we're at the part where Adam and Eve eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they experience separation in relationship. And this is incredibly alienating in every way. And this alienation is the great evil that exists throughout the Bible. And having this broken relationship is always the problem. So that gives us something that's really interesting. Sin then becomes the vehicle or the agent that brings about this brokenness. So most people, when reading Genesis, and this really comes about because St. Augustine, as Christians kind of refer to him, or Augustine, as philosophers refer to him, so I'm in the habit of saying Augustine. Augustine, a long time ago, about 400 years after Jesus died and rose again, really started telling this story of Genesis a certain way. And that stuck for the church from that point forward. And what he really saw in this story is that when they disobeyed God and rebelled from him, they ushered in what the term I'm gonna use is finitude, their finiteness, their limitedness. So the assumption is that the story would have been about them being able to live forever and to be like, that they couldn't die, that they were immortal. And then mortality comes ushered in because they rebelled against God. I don't think, in my view, that's not how the story flows. I'm not going to say that there was absolutely not finitude, but that's not the point. The point is broken relationship. Lynn?
So I think this would be a good place to hop backwards in the story and talk about why God created man.
Okay.
Because then we can put that together with why he was so bent on fixing
what's our purpose?
broken relationship, right? So I think we need to understand why he created people before we get much deeper.
Okay. So a lot of what we have going on here, and it's kind of important to say, like earlier, we kind of asked the question whether this was a literal 6 days or not. And a lot of times Genesis becomes a debate between Christians and scientists about how creation was done. Like, was it Darwinism versus something else? And that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is getting proper theology set. And in this proper theology, God is the creator, and we're supposed to learn a lot about God. And what we learn about God is not that he needs to have creation, but that he desires creation. So it's really weird that he wants to have this relationship with human beings. Human beings, by the way, that were formed from the dust of the ground. So he, in the first chapter, he creates by fiat. He declares creation, and creation responds, it was so, and comes into being. But in the second chapter, he gets his hands dirty in forming creation. So he declares by fiat, but then he's deeply committed in the bringing forth of creation and in interacting with it. He's deeply committed for the rest of the book in getting his hands dirty in creation and trying to be a part of it. He's longing for connection. And some people are going to almost claim that the way I'm talking about this is like heresy, because how can God, who is perfect and complete and holy, want humanity? I don't know, but he does. That's how the book describes it. He self-identifies desiring this creation. And so we wrote it, observe and report his self-identification. And so he says of this creation, kind of in soliloquy, I like to say. Soliloquy is when you're watching the movie and the main character is sharing his or her thoughts with you without talking out loud. You get to hear what's in his mind or her mind. And so almost in soliloquy in the story, God says to, like, within himself, let us make man or humankind. So let me pause really quick. In these first 3 chapters, there's the word Adam. We say Adam in English, and it's not too far from that in the Hebrew. That word is all over the place in those first 3 chapters. However, there are 5 times where the human is not referred to as Adam. It's referred to as a man. All the rest of the times, this word Adam is used. And I'm going to make the claim that in English, we have a confusion of translation. And so the translators have translated Adam as a proper name. And I think it should be translated more generically as the human until we get to the 5 places where the human is referred to as a man. That's going to be another theme for a different day, but we'll get there. So I'm going to start, instead of saying Adam, I'm going to start referring to that figure as the human. So let us make mankind, humankind in our image, male and female, he made them. So God is telling us a lot about how he's processing and thinking about this creation. So he singles out the human from all the rest of creation. And he does this crazy thing. I wasn't actually expecting to talk about this tonight, but this will address some of your questions there, Sal. He does this crazy thing. He creates humans, a human dual essence, male and female. Now, I'm not getting into like, people who are listening might get kind of nervous, church people, that I'm starting to talk about LGBTQ kinds of issues, and I'm not. I'm not afraid to talk about that, but that's not what this story is about. The story is about God self-identifying as having a dually essenced nature, whatever that looks like, that has a feminine quality and a masculine quality. And he creates humans also like this. And then the next thing that he kind of does is, well, before we get there, he realizes and he makes an odd observation. He observes that the human doesn't have a mate like the rest of creation. And so in a sense, he kind of proposes a lot of different kinds of solutions. He kind of runs through them. And I'm kind of I'm inferring that from the text. It doesn't really state that, but he observes that there is not a solution. So then he creates a mate for the human, which says a couple of things. On one hand, God is claiming that he's not enough for the human, or that there's a big enough gap in the difference of who they are that there's not an immediate connection. God is divine and the human is dirt. There's no connection. And so God is telling us his inner thoughts and feelings and the issues at hand here. So part of creating God in his own image is not just making a human, and not just that the human is dually essenced, but that the human was separated from itself. So God does this weird thing where he takes the human and he removes the side from it. In a lot of the English translations, the word rib is there, but that's not an accurate translation of the Hebrew. It's one of those, we can't quite get at words like firmament, but it most commonly is translated or thought to mean like a side, just side. And side is non-specific, and that's frustrating because we in our culture want precision. But I'm going to say that this gives us a lot of philosophic material. The human was set aside from itself, and that's important. Just as we are set aside from God, the human is made to be set aside from itself and also put in longing. So we are created in God's image, not just that we're human and we have a lot of characteristics of him, but we were put in the same condition that God sits in. God is set apart from his object of longing, which is humanity, and we are set apart in longing for completion as well. Lynn?
So this is like my favorite part of this story. Because growing up in the church, you hear a lot that, man was made in God's image, but they mean literally boys when they say that. By looking at this translation, And reading the story this way, men and women both were equally created in God's image. We might have been formed differently, right? Adam was, the man, the human, was made out of the dirt. And then the woman was made when God separated the male and the female, pulling the feminine out of the masculine and made two beings. But both are equally created in God's image and by themselves are incomplete. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And it's one of the it's one of the things that points to the elegance and the symmetry that God uses in this story that's all about classification and division and order and balance, and it sets the tone for the story going forward, right? So from a literary point of view, God is telling us from the very beginning that who we are is intentional, and our state of being, this longing for the perfect relationship with God, or I'm not sure how we want to put that yet, but the state of longing that we're in, we share with God, and that also is not accidental. But there aren't accidents. I mean, that's part of the point of Genesis. There aren't accidents. There might be surprises, but there aren't accidents. And if you're surprised, maybe you weren't paying attention to the fine print. Just because God gives you a lot of clues in Genesis that once you learn to catch them, help make the rest of the story make sense. And so this is one of them, this idea about how we're created, we mirror God in his fullness, and that we're a valued creation that God thinks is worth investing his time and his energy into to help us get over the fact that we're about to die in the next chapter. So go ahead.
So there's still a couple of things that need to be said and added to this because they're useful and they're meaningful and they're still setting the tone for how we're going to understand the whole rest of the Bible. So one of the things that needs to be said is that this is hugely useful as far as philosophy goes. Philosophers have struggled forever and ever to try to figure out what keeps humanity moving forward or moving in any direction. We're not stagnant. Why do we get up in the morning? Why do we not just lay down? Why do we not just go through cycles that other animals go through without seeming thought? Butterfly, like what makes us keep doing? And so different people have come up with explanations. I usually point to three people because a lot of people have heard of them or know them. But like somebody like Kierkegaard is going to say, well, we're in anxiety. And it's this anxiety that drives us. Freud famously is going to come out and say, you know what? It's libido. It's this sexual desire. It's this like
stuck on that.
it's this like intense desire to promote life and to like in this passion, right? And then somebody like Heidegger later on, who really focuses on like the idea of being and ontology, he's going to talk about we're drawn, we're called by something unknown. It's almost like a vacuum. We're just pulled by what we are not. And these things have some value. They can help us understand some things. And if we explore those ideas, they're useful. But I'm going to argue that Genesis insists that keeps us that we're in longing, God is in longing.
Mm.
And that's hugely useful because we already have an answer to some of the most fundamental philosophic questions that the greatest philosophers can't wrap their hands around. And God's answer to why we move forward is we were set in longing as he is in longing. We don't only look like him, we are like him in our conditionality. Now, the next thing that needs to be said, I told you there were a couple of things that still need to be said. There's this really, I keep saying weird part, but let's face it, there are weird parts. There's another weird part of the text that is totally out of place. And like I said, when something's out of place, we need to pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
There's this weird out of place thing that is weirdly stated that says something like, for this reason, the man will leave his mother and his father and cleave to his wife. Do you remember reading that?
It's right after Eve's created.
Okay.
So for what reason? And where did we get a mother and father from? And what are we talking about leaving them for a wife? So I am going to say that God is mother and father in a sense in this story. Now, I'm not making some dogmatic doctrinal statement. I'm not saying that God is both my father and both my mother, and I'm bringing in feminist content here. I'm not afraid to do that if the text does that, but that's not what the text is doing. We are being made known that God was their stability. God was their source. God was their protection. God was their everything. God was their nurturer, their safe place, their adequacy, their point of reference, their source of knowledge, just as parents are. They will leave their comfort zone. For this reason, the man will leave what he knows and become one with the wife. He will work into, and this the church will take to say something about this is absolutely like the marriage bed and sexuality, and this is like God is preaching about marriage. He's not so much. Just side note, the Bible doesn't have even one recording of a healthy marriage in it. This is not a statement about marriage per se. It's a statement about conditionality and how we share in God's image. And so for this reason, the man will leave his mother and father, his comfort, everything that a mother and father is. Remember, we just learned that God is dually essenced in his masculine, feminine nature. He is the parenting unit. The man will leave his parenting unit to be connected with his completion. And so it's talking about for this purpose. For what purpose? For this reason. The reason is everything that just came before. The story tells us this beautiful imagery of longing. God set humanity separated from itself as he is separated from humanity, and we share in his appearance because we have similar characteristics, and we share in his conditionality. And for this reason, we will be in longing for completion and relationship, and we will do crazy acts of love to get there. Just like God is going to do crazy acts of love to get that connection going as well. So for the reason of this story I'm telling you, of how you share in likeness with me, this dynamic will take place. Does that make sense?
Do you guys have any questions? Because we've got about 7 minutes left. So if you have questions, now would be a good time to ask them.
I think I'm following.
Crickets.
I guess I'm like,
Crickets.
yeah, I mean, I kind
So
of
I'm
took it
telling
as like
you-
that particular line, it's not like God said, it's not like that's his voice saying, you know, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast onto his wife. I mean, I'm just wrapping my head around what you said pretty much, and
Yeah,
Right, it's the
it makes
narrator
sense. But
telling
I
the
just
story.
kind of, yeah, like I kind of almost was like, yeah, he separated a woman, and Adam's all like, great, I got a wife now, and it's like, and that's why, you know,
this is why people get married.
yeah. I mean, actually, one thing I like this. I'm probably as naive about evolutionary theory as I am about the Bible, but like it would seem there'd be a pretty big like chicken or the egg kind of situation with how we evolved to be, male and female. This is nice and simple and clean, so I like it.
Me too.
So I'm going to throw this out there really quick too. Later on, Paul, or somebody writing as Paul, is going to refer to this text, and the church has really run with that text to talk about what marriage is supposed to look like. And if we ever get there, when we were to get to the point where Paul refers to this, I'm going to say, if he understood it in light of what I'm saying, it takes on a completely different meaning, and that's useful. So the way I'm telling this story is a lot different than the way Augustine told the story, which means it's a lot different than how the church typically tells this story. Now, there are a couple of things to know about that. One, it's one version of the story. And this story is meant to take lots of different angles away from it. So I'm not saying this is the only way to understand the book, but I'm saying that this is a way to understand the book that gives us a whole lot of insight into the rest of the Bible. So I'm not saying this is the absolute end all be all final version take of it, but it's a very good take on it. And it's true to the text, and it helps us understand the book. We have a lot in philosophy. We talk about costs and gains. There are a lot of gains and very few costs in this version of the story.
And it also is like math, right? If you have a formula, the rules are the same no matter what numbers you plug in, right? So distance always is going to equal rate times time, and it doesn't matter which values you plug in for those letters. So these definitions that we're identifying in Genesis, like the definition of death and the definition of sin and the definition of all of these other things that we're going to be looking at, are going to come up over and over again in the Bible. And
Okay, now I'm following.
so this is how Genesis becomes a legend for the rest of the Bible, right?
Yeah.
Because we're
Yeah.
going to read this creation story.
Yeah, because
And-
man's separated from God. Man and woman are separated from each other, and it's like we're trying to get back to God. That's like the arc of the book.
Yes, and that's the longing, right? That God longs for relationship for us for whatever crazy reasons he has, right? He's God. He gets to know his own mind. And we long for completion in relationship with each other and in relationship with God.
Right. And so I'm going to say one thing, Sal, you're really tracking, but there's an important thing that we have to add into the story because it's in the text. There are two cherubim at the end of these 3 chapters that are stationed at the edge of Eden after Adam and Eve are expelled from it, that keeps them from going back in. So it's important to know that.
Flaming sword or something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's
What is up with
flaming
that?
sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree life. Yeah, I see that.
Right. So the answer to the story is not regression. The answer to the story is not getting back to utopia. The answer to the story is not getting back in relationship. It's to progress. And so our endpoint should be in a different place than Eden, and it should look different than Eden, but should have rules that follow and are like the same, like Lynn was saying.
You have a question from Tina Maxwell. She says, real quick, I guess Mary and Joseph's marriage was messed up because she was pregnant.
It is messed up in some big ways, and that's part of what makes this good storytelling. But what we see is over time, divinity starts being committed to crazy acts of love where it determines to become humanity to make connection.
So Joseph
and
was the one committing the crazy act of love in not kicking his fiance out.
Yeah, because she was pregnant. And it won't his baby.
But the Holy Spirit comes into humanity without cheating, in the sense that, like, if somebody else were writing this story, or if we were talking about a different God, this God would not have a need to become human, or if it did, it could take any kind of shape or form. But this God dots his I's and crosses his T's and becomes human in legitimate ways on legitimate terms and has legitimate human experience. He doesn't cheat and like hold on to his divinity. He puts his divine hands behind his back, so to speak, and limits himself. And we'll learn that kind of lingo in like the New Testament, like in the book of Hebrews and other places where it talks about how he completely humbled himself to be in the form of human and function as a human and walk amongst us and experience what we experience.
Well, I know we're about out of time. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say maybe like next week we can get into, before we get any deeper, just like the snake and the.
Oh yes.
I mean, you said sin earlier. I don't see sin in the book.
We have to talk about the fall. Yes.
But yeah, I'm pretty interested in that. But maybe next week.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. We're going to get into a lot of these other different elements. So the Imago Dei, the image of God, is one of the big themes that I wanted to hit. And there are at least two other themes that are at least this big that we need to talk about. And of course, there are lots of other little things to fill in the blanks. But this is one of the big ones, and it's going to serve us well as we read through the Bible. And there's still a little bit more to say about it when we're talking about Eve and when we're talking about the man. And we'll tackle that next week.
Do you have a homework for us?
Yeah.
Any good chapters? What should we do?
Well, I think you should reread chapters 1 through 3.
Deeper.
Oh yeah.
And
I
see
agree.
if you notice what changes now that we've given a definition for death. And briefly, we had one for sin.
Yeah, and I will develop the idea of sin more a little bit later, but I really want you to pay attention to the dynamics of the human. And remember, we should be calling it the human if we're taking, just follow this storyline. So notice the difference between the human, the interactions and the differences between the human and the woman. And she's always called the woman too, until she's called Eve. And I want you to notice when she's called Eve and what's going on there and what that's all about.
Right on.
Okay.
All right. Are we
anything besides just reread the first 3 chapters of Genesis?
We're going to be at the first 3 chapters for a while because there's so much to work out. And we're only going to scratch the surface, but we're going to scratch the surface enough to get us through an understanding of the Bible.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it is kind of forcing me to pay attention to the text more, maybe read into, I guess, what's being said instead of just reading it. I don't know how to explain it. I want to see it the way you guys are seeing it, on my own.
And so a really good trick, I tell all my students this, is to read with Post-it notes.
Okay.
I mean, I write in all my books,
Yeah.
which I know is sacrilege to some people, but So if you have questions, you can jot it down on the Post-it note and stick it right on the page.
Mhm.
So when we come back next week, if you have like a observation or a question, or maybe you wonder how this connects with something else you know about the Bible, just jot it down and stick it right on the page.
Okay.
And then when we come back, we can, it'll be right in the front of your head.
This
You'll
is
remember what you're thinking.
Okay.
Okay.
I've got to
All
go
right, team.
research this chicken or egg situation.
I am going to cut us from the live feed on Facebook. So everybody say bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.